Hi traders, welcome to the for loop lesson. So this is where the course starts to get a little bit more advanced, a little bit more complex, as we start experimenting with the more advanced features of PineScript. And hopefully you've watched the previous lessons leading up to this lesson, because this is where we start building on all of the information that we've covered so far. So I'll get to explaining what a for loop is in a moment, but just to begin this lesson, I thought it might be interesting to show you a practical use case for loops, which is this script you see down here. This is a relative volume script, and what you see it doing here is comparing the current bar's volume to the volume on the previous day at that time of day. So for example, I have two vertical lines here. If you look down here, you can see they're both placed on the 10 a.m. candle. And if I hover my mouse over this 10 a.m. candle, look down at these values here. These are our volume values. The only numbers I want you to pay attention to are the first two. So when I hover my mouse over this bar, we have 1566.15 in gray and 853 in red. 853 is the current day's volume. That's what this red bar is drawing. And 1566 was how much volume printed at 10 a.m. on the day before. So when I hover over this bar, you can see that the red number there, the current volume on this bar, was 1566. So I've set the look back on this indicator to 1. So we're looking back one day. If I set this to 10, then it would average the volume at 10 a.m. across the past 10 days, and it would be comparing the current volume to that average. But I set it to 1 just so it's easier to understand what's going on here. Anyway, the whole reason I'm showing you this script is because this script is only possible to create because of for loops. I use a for loop in this script to count the volume on every 10 a.m. bar looking left over our look back period. So if I open up the source code of this script, here is my for loop. And what this for loop is doing is looping over our look back period. So it's starting at 1, counting up to our look back period, and using that look back period, I, to skip any bar that is not a 10 a.m. bar or whatever time frame you've loaded on your chart. The script will add up how many bars printed between these two and use a for loop to add up the total volume, and then it just divides that total volume by the look back to get the average. So with the look back period of 1, we don't have an average. We are literally just comparing today's volume to yesterday's at whichever time of day we hover over. If I go down to a 15-minute chart, it's the same thing. We are comparing the 10 a.m. 15-minute bar to yesterday's 10 a.m. 15-minute bar using this for loop. Now, there are many useful cases for for loops. I'm just showing you this example because it's one of the simplest ones I can think of to show you in a script that I've already created. So let's get rid of this and delete the script and open up a blank script. And we'll start experimenting with for loops, and I'll explain how they work step by step. So for our first example, let's try counting how many green bars printed over the past 10 bars. To do that, we need to create a new variable called green candles. We'll set this to 0. So we start with 0 candles, 0 green candles, and then we loop over the past 10 bars, and we'll count up every bar that closed green. To do that, we use the for keyword or operator, and now we need to declare a counter variable. So a for loop can be thought of as a loop that counts. And now you can call this counter variable anything you want. You could call it X, you could call it counter. The standard practice in most programming languages is to just call it I, and I is short for index. So we start with an index of 0 in this case. And this number could be anything we want. We could start our counter from any number we want to, but for this example, we'll start from 0, and we will count to 9. Now, this is going to count 10 times. The reason for that is we start at 0 and count up to 9. So 0 counts as our first loop, and 9 will be our 10th loop. It's a little bit confusing. It takes some getting used to if you're new to programming, this whole idea of counting from 0 equals 1. But just think of it this way. We are going to use this I variable. So every time this for loop loops, I will increment by 1 until we hit 9, and then the loop will exit, and whatever code comes below it will execute. So this loop will just keep looping over and over and over and over 10 times, and then it will break and then do whatever other code is below this for loop. And we can reference this I variable within the loop, which means we can use this I variable to reference historical price action. And that's what we're going to do here in order to count our green candles. And so what that means is, if we start with an I equals 0 count, and let's say we use that I variable to reference the closing price of a historical bar, 0 will give us the index of the current bar, because the current bar's index is 0, and then we count up from 0 as we loop back over historical price action. So this might make more sense when we actually write out some for loop code to count the green candles. But before we do that, it's important to mention how for loop structure works. So a for loop has what is called a scope. And the scope is basically the code that belongs to this loop. If you don't correctly define your scope, then PineScript might think that some of your code is meant to be executed within this loop when it's not meant to be. The way we tell PineScript what code belongs to this loop is simply by tabbing. Just hit the tab key or hit space 4 times. And then any code we write here, and we can have as many lines of code as we want, as long as we've tabbed or spaced 4 times after this for loop, all of this code belongs to this for loop and will be executed however many times this loop loops for. Executed is probably a pretty strong word. Let's just say run. The code is run every time this loop is looped. So let's count up some green candles. Tab, and then we need to overwrite our green candles variable. Remember, to do that, we need to use the colon equals, not just an equals. If we use just an equals, that means we're creating a new variable within the scope of this for loop, and you'll get an error. So if I do this, for example, and save my script, we'll get a warning. It's not an error, but we get a warning. Shadowing variable green candles, which exists in parent scope. So in this case, the parent scope is our core script body. Basically, what we've done here is we've created green candles here within the scope of our entire script. So our entire script has access to green candles. Then we've created a for loop with another green candles variable that only exists within our for loop scope. And so we actually have 2 variables here. We have 2 unique variables with the same name, which is obviously confusing. And that's why that warning pops up. It's saying, do you mean to use 2 variables with the same name? In this case, we don't. We want to override this existing variable with a new value. To do that, we use the colon equals operator. And now it's very easy to count up our green candles. All we need to do is say green candles plus, and then I'm going to open up some parentheses here. So we're assigning or reassigning green candles to whatever the current green candles value is, plus, and then we can check, does the bar that we're looping over close greater than it opened? If so, we want to add 1 to our green candles variable. Otherwise, we want to add 0 to that variable and leave it as it is. Now, if I plot our green candles value down here and set my code, and let's add this to our chart. Now we are counting how many green bars have printed over the past 10 bars, including the current bar. So if I count back out 10 bars again, and we hover over the current bar, you can see that the counter down here says 4. And if we zoom right in close here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 green bars over the past 10 bars of price action. Now, there is another way we could have done this. We could also use an if statement. So we can nest an if statement within the scope of this for loop, and we could say if the close of our current loop index is greater than the open of that same bar, then increment green candles by 1. If I save this code, we get exactly the same thing. 4 bars over the past 10 bars of price action. And notice that as we write out more code here, we have this faint vertical line drawing there. This represents the scope of our if statement. So we have our for loop scope, which contains all of this code. Then we have our if statement scope, which contains all of this code. And because we've tabbed or spaced 4 times since creating this if line of code, all of this code will only be executed if this if statement is evaluated as true. Or in other words, if the current bar closed higher than opened as a green bar. And so depending on what you're doing with your for loop, you may need to use if statements to be able to execute multiple lines of code here. Otherwise, you can just use that ternary or conditional operator, the question mark colon thing, to shorten this block of code to just 2 lines. For now, we'll leave it like this because I think this is just a little bit more intuitive to beginner programmers to understand what's happening here. So that's how you count from a lower number to a higher number. You can also count backwards. So we could set 9 and 0 here. And now the script will count from the 10th bar back. So it will start counting on this bar and it will continue counting down to the current bar index, which is 0. So remember, we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And if I save the script, we'll still be getting 4 down here because there are still 4 green bars over that price action, even though we're counting in the opposite direction now. We're counting from left to right instead of from right to left. So you can count in either direction using for loops. You can also skip over bars. So if you wanted to count every second bar instead of every single bar, you can use the by keyword. So by default, our for loops count from this number to this number by 1, increments of 1. If I change this to 2, for example, and I save the code, we'll be getting a very different value here. And you can see that if I hover over the current bar, the number is actually 2. The reason for that is we are counting, and let me just flip these around so it's not too confusing, counting backwards. So now we're counting from 0 to 10, the 0 bar to the 10th bar by increments of 2, which means we are skipping every second bar. And so if I draw out our bars here, we're counting up to this bar by increments of 2. So we're counting this bar, we're counting this bar, we're counting this bar, we're counting this bar, and then this bar. So this bar does not get counted, this bar does not get counted, neither does this, or this, or this. And then once our loop counter hits 9, it outputs how many green candles we added up. And if I leave my mouse over this current real-time bar, you can see that's 2. That's because we only counted 1, 2 green bars, and then we skipped all the other green bars in our loop. And now you can count by increments of anything you want. So for example, you could count from 0 to 100 by 10. And now we'll only be counting every 10th bar and skipping 10 bars in between each loop. So that's how for loops work. It's quite simple. Now, one thing you should know is that you could make these variables input variables. So for example, we could have lookback equals input.int, and we'll just set it to 10 by default. I can copy that into our for loop, save the script, and now the user can change our lookback period dynamically. And that is really it for for loops. They're not particularly complicated. They do take some time to get used to wrapping your head around how they work when you're doing complex analysis. But in terms of their structure, how they are written, they're not that complicated. We have a counter number, we have the beginning counter number and the end counter number. We can say what increment we want to count by. By default, it's 1. So if I get rid of that, we're just counting from this number to this number in increments of 1. And then we can reference this counter in our script to reference indicator values, price values, and whatever else you can think of to count. Now, there are 2 other things I want to cover before we wrap up this lesson, and that is the continue and break clause. So this code right here will loop from 0 to 10. Let's change this back to 9. So now this code is exactly what we had earlier in the lesson. We're counting from 0 to 9, which means the past 10 bars, starting with the 0 bar. Now, let's start with the continue clause. The continue clause skips this loop and moves on to the next loop. So the way we could use that, for example, we could still count all of these green candles, but we could do it slightly differently. If I bring this green candles count down, so I get rid of that space, that tab, those 4 spaces, now this counter code is within the scope of our for loop, and it's no longer in the scope of our if statement. If I tab here, I can write a continue clause in here that will skip this loop if this statement is true. So if I flip this operator around, so now we're saying, is the current bar of this loop bearish? Did it close lower than it opened? If so, then we want to continue. Another way you could think of this word is skip. So think of this as just typing skip. The continue clause will stop here, and let's say we're on counter number 5, and then we find a bearish bar. The loop will not execute this code. It will just continue on to count number 6. So if I save this code, we should still be getting 4 on the current bar, because we are still looping from 0 to 9, but every time we encounter a red bar, the for loop is skipping this code here, and our green candle counter never increases on red bars. So that's what the continue operator does within a for loop. Let's have a look at the break clause or break operator. That does the same thing as continue, except that it exits the entire for loop. So let's say here, if the current bar in this loop closes higher than the previous bar in our loop, then we want to break out of the loop. What this code will do is we'll count from 0 to 1 to 2, and then when we get to this bar right here, when this code executes, this if statement will be true because this bar closed higher than the previous bar's high in our loop. So we're using the series operator here, or the historical operator. We're not checking the current loop value, we're checking the current loop value plus 1. So 0, 1, 2, and then I plus 1 would be 3, which would give us this bar's high. When we get to that bar and this if statement is true, this break command or clause will exit our entire loop, and our green candle count will remain as 0 because we don't have a green bar here, we don't have a green bar here, we do have a green bar here, but we break out of our for loop before we add it up. So let me save this code, and now you can see when we hover over the current bar, our green candle count is 0. But if we go back a few bars to this bar here, we actually have 3 green bars. We have this bar, and this bar over our look back period, because none of these green bars close higher than the previous high. And so they are counted because our break clause is never executed. So that is it for for loops. They're a little bit more advanced, or certainly a lot more advanced than what we've covered so far. But you won't be using these particularly often in your scripts. There are certain times when it's useful. For example, my rvol by time indicator makes use of for loops. I also have a few for loops in my Zen library script that counts how many bars closed above or below a certain moving average. You can count how many bars printed while the RSI was overbought or oversold using for loops and things like that. These are great for counting how many times something happened in recent price action. One important thing to mention before we wrap up this lesson is that you should not reference indicator values inside your for loop. What I mean by that is, if we try to get a moving average inside of our for loop, if I save this code, we'll get a warning. ta.ema should be called on each calculation for consistency. It is recommended to extract the call from this scope. What that means is, in order for PineScript to accurately calculate the 50 period moving average, or any indicator value for that matter, this indicator function needs to be called on every single bar on your chart. And I just showed you how this code here skips certain bars, which is going to break our EMA function. So what to do if you're going to use indicators in your for loops is you need to extract this from the scope. So in other words, you need to cut that code and paste it outside of your for loop, paste it above your for loop. Now we could reference the EMA. So for example, let's change this code to say close I over EMA. And let's also plot the EMA so we can see it on our chart. Now if I save the script, we have our moving average here. And let's get rid of all this code for a moment. And let's change this to count how many bars closed above the moving average. Indent that, save the script. So now when I hover over the current bar, we have 0 bars that have closed above our moving average over the past 10 bars. But if I hover over this bar, we have 5 bars that have closed above the moving average over the past 10 bars. And notice we don't get any warning because we've extracted the indicator call from the for loop scope. That means that our indicator function is being called on every single bar in our chart, even though it's only referenced on some bars in our for loop. Anyway, that will do it for this lesson. Pun definitely not intended. And I hope you found it interesting. I will speak with you in the next lesson.